This is Ian Hartley.
I am Warren Kay.
And I am Sasha Steenbergen.
Welcome to the Rediscovering God Dialogue.
We invite you to join us as we endeavor to see Him more clearly
And love Him more dearly while following Him more nearly.
Today, we continue on this journey to rediscover God. And we're now in Genesis chapter 15, where God reaffirms his unconditional promise to Abram. So, Sasha, why don't you start us off by reading the first verse?
Sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision and said to him, "Do not be afraid, Abram, for I will protect you, and your reward will be great."
So sometimes we don't read these verses just for what they are. For instance, here, God says, don't be afraid. So what's that mean?
Well, initially, when I saw that, I thought, oh, there's another time where God shows up and the person is afraid. But when you put it in its context, you realize that he has just gone to war, and so yeah, he would have reason to be afraid that these kings could join together again and come back and retaliate against him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he's living as a foreigner in this country.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't own any land. He's lied to the people around him. They don't trust him. And like you pointed out, he's just gone to war. So you can expect some retribution.
Mm-hmm.
So it really reminds me of the importance of reading it in context, of not just reading that verse standing alone, but putting in the context of the whole story that what he's just gone through. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He still doesn't have any children.
Mm-hmm.
He's gone through a violent episode that's traumatized him and his men. And he might even be wondering if leaving was the right thing for him to do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure when he left Ur to respond to God's call, he didn't expect that he was going to be going into war and fighting battles like that, like he had just done.
So God says to him, do not be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
I will protect you and your reward will be great. So we're ready for verse 2.
But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, what good are all your blessings when I don't even have a son? Since you've given me no children, Eliezer of Damascus, a servant in my household, will inherit all my wealth. You have given me no descendants of my own son, of my own, so one of my servants will be my heir.
So you see what's happening here is Abram is debating God. God says your reward will be great, and he says, oh, I don't even have a child.
Mm-hmm.
My servant will be my heir.
Mm-hmm.
This is very important to notice that when God communicates with Abram, he usually dialogues with God. There's a counter response going on. We'll pick this up a few more times. And when we get to chapter 22, and the narrative says God told him to go and sacrifice his son, there's no dialogue about this. It just happens. It's very uncharacteristic of Abram's relationship with God.
Right.
So I'm just setting you up for chapter 22.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll make no bones about it.
Do you think does the servant know, like in the culture there, that if he doesn't have a son, that he would inherit all of his wealth?
I like your question. I haven't ever thought about it.
Well, because I'm just wondering if this is something that this servant thinks about ever and, wonders how this goes. Because I don't know, is this a cultural practice that the servants, whoever I assume is the most part of this life or whatever. But I mean, that'd be quite something on his part, thinking that maybe he's actually going to have a different life for himself at some point.
So we've got a parallel when Ishmael is born, and everybody assumes he's going to inherit. And then suddenly Isaac's born, and Ishmael loses his position as heir of Abram.
Yeah.
This could very well be that Eliezer understood. They may have discussed it, they may not have discussed it.
I mean, you've hinted before that perhaps Lot was a possibility, but that seems to have become less of a possibility because of his choices to live in the, kind of they separated. And so it seems that Abram is realizing, no, Eliezer will probably be a better one to inherit my wealth than Lot.
Yeah.
We're on verse 4 and 5.
Then the Lord said to him, "No, your servant will not be your heir, for you will have a son of your own, who will be your heir." Then the Lord took Abram outside and said to him, "Look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many descendants you will have."
So Abram never realized this promise. This will only come true for him on the new earth.
That will blow him away.
Yeah.
So, there's a parallel with the thief on the cross who asked Jesus to remember him. And Jesus says to him, "Sure, I'll remember you, but actually you'll be there with me."
Right.
This is the amazing thing about God's promises, is they embrace much more than we can imagine. So now you've got this astounding statement in verse 6.
And Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous because of his faith.
So what does this mean, that Abram believed the Lord? What's that mean? Well, firstly, hopefully it meant that he was no longer living in fear of what was going to happen to him. But then contextually, they've been talking about a child for him. So he believes that a child will be born to him. He will manipulate that. That Sarah's suggestion was Hagar, but later on. But at this point, the statement that he believed God can include that. But it can include more than that. Not having a child of your own in biblical philosophy meant that you'd done something wrong. And that God had closed the womb of your wife. So when it says he believed God, it means that he's actually going counter culture for his time. Sarah hasn't had a child, and he believes God is going to give her a child. It also means that the Lord doesn't hold his many mistakes against him.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and he's certainly got a few mistakes that he's feeling guilty about that God could hold against him.
Well, and it does really make me think of that idea that he wants good for us, and that just as we don't hold things against our kids when we know they're just trying to figure life out, same here too, that he wants good for him, that he wants him to have a family that is his own. And I love that about God.
Mm-hmm.
So God's promises, God's covenants with us are describing a process, not a one-off event.
Mm.
So the Lord makes his unconditional promise. Abram questions it. God confirms it. And now Abram believes it.
Mm.
Yeah, and this happens a few times in his life. And honest people will admit that their marriages are like this.
Mm.
You know, periodically you wonder if you should have left of the Chaldees.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you get my drift.
True. Mm-hmm.
And you have to renegotiate your relationship. And if it survives, it's stronger for it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
You all sound very subdued to me. So let's talk about something else. Verse 7.
Sasha.
Oh, sorry. Then the Lord told him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as your possession.
So here we get into this dialogue again. Next verse.
But Abram, oh, sorry, go ahead.
But Abram replied, O sovereign Lord, how can I be sure that I will actually possess it?
Yeah, I mean, this is what made me think that he was wondering if leaving Ur was the right thing to do because of this dialogue. He's saying, I left Ur and Haran. I own no land. I have no child either. So what's all this big promise about?
Mm-hmm.
So now we get into this cutting a covenant, which is a Hebrew cultural term.
Just before you get there, because it sounds like it's going to get really interesting here, but I was just curious to know, like, it always strikes me as a little bit like when God is saying, like, I will give you this land and, you know, this is going to be yours. I always wonder, what about all the people who were living there and having a life there? And where are these people going to go? Well, how are they going to feel about having somebody coming in and just taking this land, or having this land somehow taken out of their hands? I just don't understand this in the Old Testament.
And Warren wants to answer that.
Yes, indeed. Oh, well, my speculation, obviously I wasn't there. I think a lot of the land wasn't inhabited. Like there was, the population was minimal, I'm guessing, and that there were a lot of acres of land that nobody was doing anything with, just like was the case here in North America at one point in time. There were people here, obviously, that got displaced. And I suppose there were some people that got displaced there. There were communities and settlements. And yeah, that is a concern, legitimate concern for sure.
You raise the whole issue of displacing people groups. And we don't know what God's plan was for that to happen because it got couched in war language. And in spite of the fact that God said he would go ahead of them, and they wouldn't have to fight, they elected to fight and turned it into massacre of peoples and cities and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, I just keep coming back to that. I feel like to understand these kinds of things, it's important for me to know that he has good planned for all his children, including the people who live there. And even if they didn't recognize that he was their father or someone who was caring for them, that he loved all his children or loves all his children the same.
Mm-hmm.
So your question leads me to what will happen to this world eventually. Some people are going to be displaced and other people are going to populate the new earth. So what's happening here is sort of a foreshadowing of what will eventually happen at the end of the world. So there's something about the choices we make that determines our continuance as human beings. Now, usually the destruction of people groups is attributed to God in the Old Testament. But that's our way of human thinking. When you think of when the Jews were carried off to Babylon, or they were carried off by the Romans or by the Assyrians, most people attribute that to God also. But this is just a consequence of human wickedness and failure to be what God wanted them to be.
Yeah, yeah.
And the natural consequence of not paying their taxes, and this, so the ruling government comes in and takes you off.
Good. Thank you.
So we're on verse 9.
Yes. Now to the covenant. The Lord told him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon.
So usually male animals are brought, but sometimes female animals are used. And this is one example. And there are other examples. We're not going there today. So we now come to what's going to happen to these animals. But before we get there, this process is culturally defined. It's described in Jeremiah 34:18-19. And I think that we need to read that just so that we know that this is widespread, a widespread process of making an agreement between two parties. Jeremiah 34:18-19.
Because you have broken the terms of our covenant, I will cut you apart, just as you cut apart the calf when you walked between its halves to solemnize your vows. Yes, I will cut you apart, whether you are officials of Judah or Jerusalem, court officials, priests, or common people, for you have broken your oath.
So here's an example from another time where they'd made a covenant by walking between animals that had been cut in half. And now that's being used to indicate that the covenant has been broken. So today we have some sort of official that officiates at a wedding, which is a very serious covenant. And that official has replaced the dead animals that were used by the people of that time.
So Ian, explain what actually happens here.
Okay, so let's read the next verse. And that saves me a lot of words. Verse 10.
Okay, so Abram presented all these to him and killed them. Then he cut each animal down the middle and laid the halves side by side. He did not, however, cut the birds in half. Some vultures swooped down to eat the carcasses, but Abram chased them away.
So the divided animals are symbolic of what must happen to the one who breaks the covenant promise. It is the equivalent of signing a binding legal agreement. The birds of prey that swoop down are symbolic of the threat to the covenant, and by chasing them away, Abram holds with or defends the covenant agreement.
So as this verse in Jeremiah says, the agreement is made. They cut these animals in half, walk through between the two halves, and in doing that, they're saying, if I break this covenant, this is what you can do to me, or if you break this covenant, this is what I can do to you.
Yeah, it's a good description.
Mm-hmm.
This practice seems like it was born from the work of hunters. I just don't see the women in the community deciding that this is the way to show a covenant, but that's just me.
So when I was young, my mother used to kill the chickens.
Okay.
Okay, so, and I want to remind you about I think her name was Deborah, who cut off Sisera's head when there was a war between Israel and, I've forgotten who they were, Canaanites.
Yeah.
So when you get a woman mad, expect the worst.
Look out.
Sure, there you go.
So, Sasha, you see, you've never had a wife who woke you up in the middle of the night and said, we have to talk.
Oh, I love it, Ian. I love it.
So they're cutting this covenant. Now, the covenant is between Abram and God. And so Abram has to walk through the middle of them, and God has to walk through the middle of them to make this a binding covenant. And so this is a process. We'll read verse 12 and then we'll get into 13.
As the sun was going down, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a terrifying darkness came down over him.
Okay, so this darkness represents a depression or foreboding that comes over Abram. And it is duplicated with what happened when Jesus died. Don't miss the symbolism. We would like to have God operate in our timetable, but we are not in control of the Lord. Out of the darkness, we know something is about to happen, but we don't know what. And there come times like this in a person's life. And you have these forebodings and a time of darkness. And usually it's difficult for us to trust God at that moment. We rehearse our failures in the past, and we rehearse times when we feel God let us down in the past. And that's what's happening here. A terrifying darkness came down over him. You know, sometimes in our Christian witness, especially in church, we present this triumphalistic picture of what it means to be a Christian. We seldom talk about times when we prayed and it felt like and seemed like that we were abandoned by God.
Yeah.
We only talk about times when we prayed and we got answers. And so when you do that, you alienate yourself from the people who are listening to you. They might claim they're inspired, but the real witness is that, you know what? This didn't work out well for me, but God was with me.
Yeah.
So how this plays out in Christian communities is that, for instance, when divorce occurs, usually at least one of those people prayed to God to save the marriage. It didn't happen. They've got nothing to brag about. And they've only heard bragging stories in church. So church is not much good for them.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point, because there are a few times when I can look and see how God has made himself known in my life. But there are many, many more times that he's just strangely silent. And but you're right, we don't talk about those.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like we don't say to each other, you know, I'm really in a dark place.
Mm-hmm.
Come and pray for me.
Mm-hmm.
I need you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what is actually true at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're on verse 13 to 16.
Then the Lord said to Abram, you can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land, where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years. But I will punish the nation that enslaves them, and in the end they will come away with great wealth. As for you, you will die in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. After 4 generations, your descendants will return here to this land, for the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction.
So the foreboding that Abram had is going to come true with the slavery in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And God says, yeah, I know that we don't live happily ever afterwards. Yeah, there will be trouble for your descendants, but I will see them through it and rescue them. So trust me.
Yeah. And so I'm just wanting to clarify here, because I just remember how I felt, you know, what is it, 2 years ago, when I would read something like this where it says, but I will punish the nation. That this is potentially the sense that he got, that he understands God is the one who is going to you know, sort of make the bad guys pay, so to speak. But that we understand it as prediction versus causation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good reminder.
So we have this problem all through our history. Started with Adam and Eve, is that when misfortune comes to us, we somehow blame God for it.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
No, Adam says the woman you gave me. The woman says the serpent you made.
Yeah.
So did God love the Egyptians? Yes. Did he send the plagues to destroy the Egyptians? No. The plagues were there to point out to the Egyptians that it was God who was protecting them all along. And if they looked to him, he would continue his protection. This is very important, because we come to the 7 last plagues just before Jesus comes. And the writer of Revelation, or the translators, make it appear that these awful calamities are coming from God. But the calamities are evil's response to the blessings of God. So that's a long story that needs a lot of decoding.
But that's really helpful to reframe those 7 last plagues, because you're right. It's usually traditionally described as disasters that happen because of what God has done, that God initiates them. When, as you're saying, God initiates blessing, and that's evil's response to the blessing.
Yeah.
So are you, oh yeah, go ahead, please.
No, ask your question.
Oh, I was going to say, so in the case then of the Egyptians here, so obviously a big force is sort of coming in the sense that we're having God through Moses saying, you know, we're going to take these people out of here. We're going to provide protection for them. And so then you're saying that in response to this, there was this backlash from the evil one to do anything he can to disrupt this mission, like to have everything happen possible to make that not happen.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, for instance, the first plague on Egypt was boils, these sores on men and beast.
Mm-hmm.
So now we don't know what Moses said to Pharaoh. We only have the record, and the record is couched in this way of God destroying the Egyptians, because that's how they saw the interplay of God with other gods.
Mm-hmm.
But from when Jesus came, what Moses could have said, following Jesus' life and the way he spoke, is, look, God has been protecting you from all these boils that are endemic in the land of Egypt. And if you don't let my people go, you force away God's protection, and you're going to have an epidemic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. That is terrifying.
One of the ways I know this to be true is that the Egyptian magicians were able to replicate some of these miracles.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, we'll have to take a look at that whole story, but not today.
Yeah. I'm there for it.
Yeah, and so it's interesting that in verse 16, it says, after 4 generations, your descendants will return here to the land. For the sins of the Amorites do not yet warrant their destruction. So this took 400 years from the time. So it's from this passage that we calculate that a generation was about 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Because that gets changed and reduced to about 40 years later on, but at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 17.
After the sun went down and darkness fell, Abram saw a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch pass between the halves of the carcasses.
Yeah, so this symbolism is talking about God is now passing between the cut animals also. So why a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch? Well, you know, we have matches and butane lighters if we want fire, but they didn't. And so the symbols of light and warmth in the smoking fire pot and the flaming torch represent the comforting presence of the Lord. And they're also prophetic, because when the Israelites journey through the wilderness, they have a pillar of cloud and a column of fire by night.
Mm-hmm.
And these are a comforting presence to them, the whole encampment. So light in the Bible represents goodness, and darkness represents evil. And so in 1 John 1 verse 5, the writer will say, God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Now that's symbolic. That's saying God is only good and there's no evil in him. Now we just read that, but that took thousands of years for human beings to finally register.
Yeah. Amen.
And yet all the symbolism is there.
And it's still taking time for people to recognize what it's really saying.
Yeah.
The burning bush, the Shekinah glory, and Jesus as the light of the world all illustrate the role of the Lord's light in our journey. So when in John chapter 1 it says that in him was life, and that life was the light of the world. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has never overcome it. That is a monumental statement of encouragement and promise. However dark evil is, it will not overcome the goodness of God.
Amen.
That the story of Abram is the story of the faithfulness of God, not the faithfulness of Abram. Abram is called the father of the faithful because he believed God was faithful.
Yeah.
You know, we have this ability to twist the virtue of God to our own benefit and to think that all these good things happened to Abram because he was faithful. And so this gets twisted in Christianity into the belief that there's something in us that makes us good enough to be saved. We must do something in order to be saved. And we discount the faithfulness of God. Now, it is true that you can reject the salvation of God, but God purposed to save us before he made the world. And we have never been able to stop him doing that.
Yeah, it's really reassuring to realize that the faithfulness is on God's part, not on our part.
Well, it gives us security and courage and hope.
Yeah, good.
And the other point I wish to make here is that you can disagree with God. You can argue with God. And that doesn't mean God will not be faithful to you.
Yeah, I like the theme that you're bringing out, that Abram gets involved in these dialogues with God. He doesn't just acquiesce and say, "Okay, you said it, I believe it," and and continue on. He argues with God. Yeah, there's a relationship there.
Yeah, if you have a power relationship where you can't argue with the other person in the relationship when you see things differently, that is not a true relationship. I'm doing marriage counseling with a couple when there's almost a 10-year difference. The male is 30 years old and the woman is 20 plus a little. And I'm actually nervous about it because she just accepts what he says. Instead of saying, no, that doesn't work. And this is true with our relationship with God. If God is this monolithic, powerful deity who has no sense of dialogue with you as a person, I don't think that relationship will last. And this is why, at least I feel so lucky to live post the incarnation of Jesus, who dialogued with people. When the Samaritan woman argues with him and misunderstands him, he doesn't say to her, well, go your own way. I'll try. he actually enters into dialogue with her.
Mm-hmm.
We're on verse 18 to 21 to finish up the chapter.
So the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day and said, I have given this land to your descendants, all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River, the land now occupied by the Kenites, Kenizzites, Kadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephites, Amorites, Canaanites, Geshurites, and Jebusites.
Well done with all those tongue twisters. So only under King Solomon would Israel occupy the territory envisioned in the promise. These territorial boundaries existed from about 1000 BC to 735 BC, when the Assyrians invaded the northern area and carried off the 10 tribes into captivity and obscurity. They never returned as those in the southern part who were carried off to Babylon in about 600 BC. The people from Judah and Benjamin in the south, some of them, very few of them, returned after 70 years of captivity and rebuilt the city and the temple. So our Jewish friends are expecting the Messiah to come, and the first thing he will do, he will reestablish the sovereignty of Israel from the border with Egypt up to the Euphrates River. And then from there, it will be expanded to finally embrace the whole world. And I see that as the Abrahamic covenant.
Right.
And so their desire to push the Palestinians out is just a continuation of what was foreshadowed here.
Yes. And the hardliners in Israel, I'm talking about the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox, they actually want war. And they want Israel to recapture the Temple Mount so they can rebuild the temple. And it's the secular Jews who say, that's not reasonable.
Yeah.
So you've got all these undercurrents running, and like you never really know what another person is thinking. I'm not a cynic. I'm just saying human beings are very complex in their motivations and the way they reconstruct the world inside their own understandings. And actually very difficult to understand the other person. So chapter 12 is actually the beginning of Abram's story. And if you asked, the Jews said, Abram is our father. You can't say that we are not God's promised people, because Abram's our father. And Jesus says to them, no, your father's the devil. But what's interesting is that they didn't say God is our father. They said Abram is our father.
Right.
So in the Lord's Prayer, when Jesus starts it, our Father which art in heaven, they think, the listeners think, oh, he's talking to Abram. So Jesus has to add, which art in heaven. And this is the story. Genesis is the story of where Israel came from and how God protected and selected people that eventually wound up as Israelites.
Yeah.
So chapter 15 of Genesis is a rehashing of chapter 12, where God calls Abram and shows him the stars and the sand and says, your descendants will be like that. So this is a rehashing, a retelling of God's interaction with Abram, and reinforcing that his promise is true. It's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, the covenant is reestablished.
So, of course, we're going to get a lot more detail because it goes up to chapter 50 in Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about Abram's descendants, and it's the roots of Israel. So thank you for showing up. I enjoyed a few minutes with you. Let's pray together. Dear God, we know that you see us as we will be one day on the new earth. We know that you plan for us to inherit the whole earth. And not only will we inherit the earth, but you will be present and make your dwelling with us. This is unbelievable that we will be so honored. We pray for faith to trust you in your faithfulness to us every day and in every relationship that we have. And thank you that when we couldn't get it, you came in person to tell us, knowing full well how terribly we would treat you. But that did not deter you in coming to love us and serve us. You are simply amazing, and we worship you. Amen.
Amen. Find the recording of our podcast on our website, as well as the PDF document that we've been using, so you can follow along or at least see all the passages. And so that website is rediscoveringgod.ca, and on there is the PDF document, the link for the podcast, as well as our YouTube link. We are now on YouTube. So if you want to see us live, then you can go and watch it on YouTube.
Wonderful. And we'd also love to invite you to our Monday evening Zoom discussion where Ian and Warren lead us out. And we are currently going through the podcast where we get to have discussion and really dive in a little deeper and get our most pressing questions answered. It's a really wonderful time of fellowship and connection with the group. We share in community and resources as well. We'd really love to have you join us. We're going to be meeting at 6:30 Mountain Standard Time. You just add in the link 403-506-9201. We'd love to see you.
And if you'd like to connect with us, you can reach us at rediscoveringgod2020@gmail.com. Send us an email. We'd love to hear from you and know how this journey of rediscovering the God that Jesus knew is changing your life. Take care.